I'm really excited to talk about today's topic because I know that that healthy volunteers are essential to any part of ministry, and so I'm excited for our topic today and to get into this discussion. And I've talked with a lot of churches and nonprofits too that are really struggling post pandemic with kind of rebuilding their volunteer team. So I think this is an appropriate topic and an appropriate time. And so I'm really excited to dive in with Marianne today, and she's going to lead us with today's topic. And I'll introduce her in a moment. But again, if you're just joining us, on the right side of your screen, there is a chat bar, a kind of a sidebar that you can use for chat all throughout the webinar. So if you have comments or you want to add something, feel free to use the chat throughout our time together today. I'll be in there as well and responding to things. At the end of the webinar today, we'll spend a few minutes answering your questions. So if you have a question that you want to talk about at the end of the webinar, and make sure that we talk about it, on that side is also a tab that says Q&A. So you can use that, go to the Q&A tab, type your question, and I will see it, and we'll see it, and we'll get to it at the end too. That way we don't miss it as we talk throughout today's webinar, but feel free to use that anytime a question pops into your head. You'll also see a column there with polls. So throughout the webinar today, throughout our discussion, we may ask you some questions just to get your feedback or hear what your thoughts are. And you'll also see the opportunity to download the slides from today in the handouts tab. So feel free to download that and use it however you would like. So let's get started. Let's dive in because there's so much to talk about. And I just want to first thank you for joining us. This is part of our ministry at Church Juice to present tools and to present opportunities to learn and grow in the role that we are called to, whether that's a volunteer. I saw some lay people here in today's webinar, or it's your full-time job. Volunteering is an important part of what you do. And so at Church Juice, part of energizing church communications, everything that we do is building healthy volunteer teams. So that's why we present today's topic on building healthier volunteer teams. And so if you have any questions or if we can serve you in any way, feel free to reach out to us. But we are here to serve you, and we'll continue to do that. I want to introduce to you today's speaker. Marianne is a newer friend of mine. I met Marianne on the podcast when we recorded it a few weeks ago, but Marianne has been around the church world for a little while now, and I'll let her tell a little bit of her story. And you can also listen to this week's podcast episode and hear more of her story and how she came into loving volunteering so much. But Marianne grew up in a, correct me if I'm wrong, Marianne, but in a Buddhist tradition, and was not actually introduced to Christianity at all until she was 40. So mid-career, she was in corporate America, left that after becoming a Christian, and got involved in the local church in children's ministry. And that really transformed how she saw building volunteer teams and really became passionate about it. And so today she leads and works with churches and helps church leaders develop their leadership and develop how they build, equip, train, sustain healthy volunteer teams. And so she is the perfect person to talk on this topic. And so Marianne, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for talking to us today. I'm going to hand it over to you and let you dive in. All right.
Oh boy. Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having me. Welcome. It's fun seeing people that are coming in from all over the place. So welcome, welcome, welcome. First off, I'm going to be super transparent and real because that way you're not so confused later. But my mom is Japanese, and I have some Japanese language tendencies, which means some of my words may not come out correctly. So if it sounds a little bit like, what did she say? It's probably me, not you. And if you have any questions, again, as Brian said, please pop them in. I'm happy to address them. But let's dig in. So look at where we are. Volunteers are the mission. And I think the main thing that I really want to end with you at the end of the whole webinar today is that I know we're going to focus on a lot of procedures and tasks and to-dos, but the volunteers aren't there just to serve your mission or advance your mission. The volunteers are the mission. And if you don't hear anything else from me today, no matter if you're doing communications or nonprofit volunteering or what area you need volunteers, we need to remember that this is a ministry first and foremost. And if we can get that, in the forefront of our minds, and everything else that we do or talk about follows again after that. So remember, the volunteers are the mission. So let's get started. I think when you first probably signed up, it was like how to get volunteers. Well, I'm going to just pause a moment and have you think that there may be some things you are currently doing that is actually a barrier for people to start serving. So let's start there, because I'm a believer when things aren't working right, I know it's really easy to just point that finger and go, well, they, and why don't they? But I learned when I was building a volunteer ministry that a lot of it was me and what I was doing. So we need to pause, do a little self-reflection. And I don't know if you're familiar with Sam Horn. She's an amazing speaker, author, but she once said, confused people never say yes, right? I love that, because when I think about an invitation, so let's say you were to say, hey, Marianne, what are you doing Friday night? Well, if you're my husband, I would think, well, maybe we're going to go out on a date. But if I don't know you that well, right, maybe you're an acquaintance or someone I see every now and then, I'm going to need a little more information before I say yes. Like, I don't know, are you wanting me to babysit? Do you want to bring me cake? Like, what is it that you're really inviting me to? I'm a little confused. So I don't immediately go, nothing, yes, to whatever you're asking me to. And the same thing can happen with our volunteers. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time and go through 3 areas that could be barriers. So lack of information is a barrier. Mixed messages are a barrier. And guess what? Your current volunteers could even be a barrier to serving. So I'm going to walk through them real quick with you. Lack of information. So this is about the description, what people are hearing from the very beginning, like what the process is, and maybe it's your form. So description. If your description to ask people to come volunteer is, hey, come serve in children's ministry, or come serve in our tech area, or come serve wherever, that lack of information of like, what exactly do you need? I am not going to say yes right away, because back in the day when I first started serving, and Brian was right, it was in children's ministry. I loved 4th and 5th graders. Like, that was my lane. Now, my husband was all about 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, the littles. I love them. Don't love doing ministry there. And so if that was the opening, I would say, let me find someplace else to serve, because I want to serve. But if it's broad and it just says children, I may go, I'm not sure I even want to say yes. So you may have people wanting to say yes, but because you don't have a really good description in your invitation, they're not saying anything at all, right? Let's talk about processes. So sometimes the lack of information is, what is the process? A lot of times we hear, just show up. No, thank you. Like, again, we want to care for people well. These are the people that we are praying, Lord, send us volunteers. Yet we have to do our part and be very clear. Do we have a process? It doesn't have to be something complicated. I'm going to get into that later. But the lack of the information of what happens and when and how long is like the invitation again. It's like, I don't know, so I'm going to be quiet. And then here's one that I've seen a lot of times, and I've gone on church websites and even on nonprofits, and they said, hey, if you're interested in serving, fill this information out. So now I have to fill out a whole form, and you want all the information from me, but I'm not getting anything from you. It's kind of like when I was very young and naive in college, And I would be at the mall and they'd say, hey, fill out this form and you could win $500 shopping spree. And I thought, wow, that's cool. And I would do it. Little did I know that it was actually a way to get information about me so I could be called and text and basically hounded. So why don't we do something better? Why don't we be really transparent and really be good about providing some information? Mixed messages. Let's talk about how that's a barrier. So serving details, who's the boss, not talking about the TV show, and we are family. So the mixed messages of serving details. A lot of times it's would be what's said from the stage, or we always serve like this, or we always show up. But in actuality, when I do show up, it's not what it appears. So then I'm thinking, what else is not correct or clear? When I think about who's the boss, when we have a group of volunteers, sometimes people will kind of bubble up as so-called the boss or the leader, right? So, for example, I was at this one church and I thought, I want to serve in the parking lot in January, in the winter outside. So I show up and this one woman looks at me and she said, she seemed to be like in charge. And she said, hey, Marianne, would you like a sweatshirt, with the logo? And I thought, yeah, that'd be great. So she gave me the sweatshirt. I go outside. The other volunteers look at me and go, how'd you get that sweatshirt? And I said, oh, so-and-so gave it to me. And they're like, oh, she doesn't give things away very easily. And I'm thinking, what's happening here? So then I thought, well, why don't you go to our leader who was designated our leader? And then their response, and these are the volunteers saying, he doesn't do anything. She holds all the power. So now I'm mixed messages. Is he not really the leader? Is he the wrong leader? What's happening here? Didn't feel like after a pandemic situation, when I stopped serving, do I want to go back into that environment? And the last thing about we are family just simply means that sometimes there are things we say, like we have our vision, our logo, we're family, we care for you, or we're a team. And then you show up and volunteer and there's no real family. No one asks how you're doing. No one really cares. No one even knows if you have family, if you're single, if you're married. So those mixed messages possibly could be a barrier to serving. And then did you know that your current volunteers could be barriers if they're not serving in the right place, right? If they're not excited about where they're serving, if I don't even know who the volunteers are, and we look out into the space, it's like, looks like they're miserable, right? Looks like I don't want to be with those people. When you see a bunch of excited people serving in their gifts, it's just inviting, it entices. And then the excited volunteers, because they love it and they're well cared for, invite more volunteers to join them. Now, when I say excited, I want to pause a moment because I'm all, whoa, let's go. That's not what I'm talking about. Because when I was leading guest service volunteers, our production team, our head director would come to me and he'd say, so Marianne, at your next orientation, if anyone in your group hates smiling, send them to me. We'll put them behind a camera or we'll put them in the tech room. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't excited because I would always go in there and say good morning and see who was in there. They were excited because they would start talking in language I did not understand with all the gadgets and the buttons, but they would go, hey, do you see this? And this is doing this, and listen to this sound. And they just loved it versus someone sitting there going, I just have to push this every 2 minutes, right? So unexcited, not serving in the right place, those volunteers might actually be one of your barriers. And if they are, let me introduce you to the fact that you may have Avery the volunteer. That's just an acronym for the volunteer that could be in the way. What are some of the people that you look around and you're saying they're checking the box? So let me introduce you to Avery, Averi, aloof. You know what that is? Just kind of like, whatever. I'm just here. the veteran, right? The veteran is like, you would say, why would this be Avery? Well, the veteran, the strong one, I got this. I have all the information. No one shall ever know what I know. I'm in charge. I've got this. Maybe it's the erratic volunteer. You don't know, are they coming? Are they coming late? Are they leaving? Where'd they go? Are they happy? Are they sad? Always erratic. Maybe it's the rebellious volunteer, the one, especially with some of a lot of changes that we've had to go through. They're divisive, they complain all the time. And then I look at that poor, indifferent volunteer and actually on the verge of burnout. This is not how it's supposed to be. And when I go back to how I started, these people right here, they are the mission. And what's more important than anything they're doing is how they're doing, right? We should be sitting there saying to the veteran, maybe you need a more challenging role. How can we train? The erratic one, it's like, let's have that conversation. Like, did you not know this is what time we started? Maybe you don't know that this is how we roll, right? The rebellious one, I know it's hard to have those conversations, but if we are really caring and loving that person, we want the best for them. Meanwhile, while we're being silent, people are talking about them. They're getting a bad reputation. That's not caring or loving. We have to be willing to have that conversation and help them. And it has to come from a place of, hey, how are you doing? How can we help you? And then that burnout, we got to help them find a way out and get rest, that it's okay. There will be no judgment, no condemnation, no eye rolls. We want the best for them. And if the best thing for them is to just take some time off and rest or, do something different, then that's what we're called to do. So we don't want any more Averys, do we? No. I'm going to introduce you to someone else who later feels valued, included, connected, and challenged. But how do we get there? All right, I'm going to go through now. We're going to change gears through these small little steps. And I always say, I think some small steps are just as important as the giant vision or leap of faith. And what I would love for y'all to do is not go, I must do these 5 steps, because you don't. Okay. It would be really great if you just start thinking, well, what piece of this could we start talking about within our teams and our ministry and our organization? But I'm going to lay it out to you the way we used to bring people in and do our volunteers. And I hope that maybe this is helpful. So the first thing we do is, what is the foundation? When people say, Mary Ann, how do I get more volunteers? I need to recruit more people. My question is, I would like to know, what are you calling them to? Are you calling them to a bigger vision? Are you calling them to do and be part of something that they can go, wow, we get to do this together? Or are you just calling them to a task, right? The vision has got to be more important and the main thing over any task. Now, there are tasks, but that's not where the focus is. So really starting at the foundation, having those conversations. Hey, you can have them with the people who currently are serving. Ask them, hey, what's our vision? Why are we serving here? Why do we exist? Then comes invitation. So invitations are so important. Again, clarity over assumptions, right? And I've been guilty of this as well. We have assumed so much. Like, I assume people know where to park. I assume people, of course, they know that this is how we show up and roll. But we can't assume that. Number one, people aren't living and breathing it every day like we are, right? They have other lives, they have jobs, they're taking care of family. But also, we need to remember that we want to be clear and kind to people. We want them to know that they can trust us with their time, that we will steward it really well because we have thought ahead. We've done our homework. And I will say, many, many volunteers have told me, Mary, and I always was a little nervous about serving, but once we walked through everything, I knew I could trust this. I could trust the process. I could trust the people in this ministry. So we want to create baby steps. along the way. And that's really what this is. A lot of people say, hey, come serve. And then we skip 4 steps and here's your name badge. And we've missed this part. And it's so important that we spend the time here. So the baby steps, I think a great way to think about it is if you were to say to a health coach, I need to lose weight. Well, they would go, great, I need you to lose 20 pounds by the end of the week. They would say, first of all, are you healthy? Second of all, can you walk? What's your activity level? How much weight do you want to lose? How fast do you want to lose it? Do you have access to equipment? So you just kind of start breaking it down in pieces. And that's what we're doing here as well. So the invitation, clarity over assumptions. For example, a wedding invitation, you have who, where, when, how, like all those things. Think about that for your volunteers. I would tell my volunteers, for example, or those interested in serving, hey, come to the orientation on Tuesday night. The the room will be open at 6 p.m. I will have hot chocolate and cookies until 6:30, but at 6:30, we will get started. Now, what that tells people is, oh, I can't get there at 6. That's fine, but she starts at 6:30. Great. It tells some people, ooh, hot chocolate and cookies. I'm coming before then, and then I can meet and get my seat and, get my name badge. So again, you're providing clarity of, no, this time is very intentional. This is when we'll start. This is when we will end. So think about how you're inviting people. You're building trust. A tour. Okay, not everyone can do a tour, and I didn't always get to do them. But when I did, oh my goodness, it was so much fun. And what I'm talking about is if I was recruiting or bringing people into a specific area, I did not talk about just my area. I talked about the entire church. I wanted our, say, greeters to understand that when they opened the door on Sunday morning, it wasn't, I'm just at a door. It was for them to see a family walk in and go, oh my goodness, they're going to have a great time in our children's ministry, because I've seen it. I know how that works. Even though I have no children, even though there's no reason for me to know about children's ministry or a youth ministry or how our worship team prepares, I got kind of a behind the scenes tour and understanding, and I get to play a part in this. And of course, let me just add, it doesn't end in this beginning. I encourage you to constantly remind them, remember, you're not just opening a door for someone to come in. You're actually inviting people to experience what we want God to show them today. And it could be coming through this door, it could be getting coffee, it could be anything. But even if you don't physically take them everywhere, really talking about, it's about our ministry over any particular area, because this is about being united. This is about unity. This is about community. And it's always got to be bigger than any one individual. Okay, let's go to first look. So now let's say someone's like, hey, I'm interested in serving. We don't put them in a spot right away, because it's one thing to see it on paper, so to speak, right? It's one thing for someone to say, oh, you should come do XYZ. I want to feel it, understand it. And on the side of us, church leaders that are also, and leaders that are looking at this, you want to make sure you get the right people in the right spot. And sometimes that doesn't happen until they're actually in it. So here's the thing, people kind of go, what? I like to say, you don't necessarily need more volunteers. You need the right volunteers. And how do you find them and give them that space to figure it out? Well, we had a thing called First Look. In fact, our name badges would even say something like, Marianne is here for First Look. And we actually put the words underneath that, no pressure. And what that did, particularly for volunteers that were currently serving, and they were like, we need people. And they saw me with that name badge and it said no pressure. They knew, because we trained and talked about it, that I'm not going to coerce. I'm not going to bribe. We're just going to really care for this person checking it out. We hope that this is where they want to serve, but if not, that's okay. There are other places to try as well. We're just glad they're here, right? So having this no pressure really built trust that someone said, hey, I can probably try this in another area. Because sometimes people would try it and they'd go, wasn't what I thought it was, right? Think about showing up the first day at work. It looked great in the interview. You were really excited about your new job, and you show up and then you're like, I forgot to ask where the bathroom was, or I'm not sure if I was supposed to bring my own laptop. So we want to, again, care for people really well. So we had buddies that we would buddy up with people on their first look so they could ask any question they wanted, safe place, not some leader that they felt like they had to like pretend like, oh yeah, this is great. So a first look, no pressure. And then finally, let's say they were like, hey, you know what? I like that a lot. So now, great, sign up for a team. And I'm a believer in really creating real teams, not just pools of people. There is a difference. When I think about football teams, everyone knows who's going to be on the team. Everyone knows who's hurt. Everyone knows what time they're starting. Everyone shows up together. Like it is just known, embedded that this is who we are. And we just can't win the same without all of us on the field, right? So we think about how do we build real teams and how do we make sure the leaders are the right leaders. So there's a whole part to that as well. But when someone comes on and they've signed up for a team, man, we celebrate that. And we really want to make sure that they feel like they've made the right decision. So let's say you go through all this fun things. What do you have? Vic, the volunteer. No more Avery. Well, you may have an Avery here and there. That's okay. But Vic, the volunteer, is the volunteer who knows that they are valued, they're included, they're connected, and they're challenged. Okay. Let's run through this super quick for you. So Vic, the volunteer, feels valued before their first yes. So you see how we just went through the steps of the invitation before they even said. We were building that trust to say we care about you more as a person than any task we have here. Those will get done. But you are valued. Every time that you're serving, this is a safe environment. You're going to be led well. You're going to be serving in your sweet spot. It may take some tweaking to find your sweet spot. And I'm a believer also, sometimes we just do what has to get done because it just needs to get done. But that is not the norm. The norm is where people are really serving in their sweet spot. So Vic, the volunteer, feels value. They feel included. They have a voice. They own their ministry. They own their church. They own their team. They own their area. And it all starts with huddles and it ends with debrief. Now, I'm going to back up a minute because some church leaders are afraid when I say that because they're thinking, oh no, if they have too much of a voice, they're going to be complaining and running things. So while you can't stop people from complaining, you can create an intentional path that in a good, healthy way says, hey, your voice matters. We want to include you in decisions. We want to include you in feedback. And so we're going to start with our huddles and we're going to gather together and reinforce that we're a team, that every person in here matters. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a debrief. And I want to know 3 things from you. I want to know, what did you learn in church today? And it has to be only 1 sentence. Because especially for leaders, there's an accountability factor that you get into a service. And we want to know, what was a win today? Like, we're going to focus on the wins. And a lot of times you have to teach your volunteers what a win can look like, because all wins matter, big and small. And then this was my favorite. When I started it with my leaders, I would look at them and say, how could I have led you better today? And it would grow into, how could we as a team done better today? How could we have performed? And how could we have served you better today? And you know what? They would tell me, and we would get better, and we would get better. So make sure that they are included with their voice. They feel connected. Again, it goes back to real communities with real teams. And this is a discipleship. You know, the Bible says, go equip the saints. Equip the saints, not hog all the blessings. And so this simply really is discipleship at the end of the day. And so when we do that well, we really are connected to one another and to the mission. And then finally, challenged. Don't be afraid of this word. Don't say no for people. Give people permission to fail. And I'm going to hit this last question in just a minute, but I want to talk about don't say no for people. If you've done your homework and you've looked at how much you're asking them to do and what the timeline and what the guardrails are, and you've really cared for them well, then you should be confident in asking certain people to do certain things and to say, hey, I want to challenge you to fill in the blank. Ask. And then if they say no, that's okay too. Permission and celebrate the no. But I guarantee you, I have learned that there are more people waiting to be asked to say the yes. But a lot of folks don't know if they're allowed. Do they have permission? Are they qualified? Are they equipped? And I don't know about you, but that permission to fail, I have failed a lot. I don't know. Have y'all failed any? Maybe that's a good poll, Brian. Like, have you ever failed and you've been given some grace and an opportunity to do a redo, and then you learned from it and it got better? We have to do that with our volunteers as well. And then at the end of the day, the challenge to our volunteers, because they would be nervous if there was a lot of changes or they felt like too many rules, I would say, look, if you had a choice, if in the midst of serving and no one else is around to help you and answer you, but you have to make a split decision between A and B, I want you to ask the question, what is the most loving thing to do right now? And if the most loving thing to do is to leave your post so you could go care for another person, pray for somebody, walk with them, then I will have your back every time, right? Every time. Every time. Give your folks permission to fail and let them know if they do the most loving thing. Then you build a team of Vicks. Isn't that fun? Don't you want a team of Vicks? All right. Those are my notes. I just want to thank you guys for hanging in there. And I saw there were some questions that popped up, and maybe we'll be able to get to those. But please remember that no matter what size or what your folks are doing, that the people are the most important things. The volunteers are the mission. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Ann. Yeah, let's spend some time answering questions. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in that chat window. I have a couple that have come up throughout your presentation, so I'll start with there. One question that I have gotten pretty often is for especially knowing your background in children's ministry. A lot of children's ministry leaders or even other ministry leaders, when they look at recruiting volunteers, they have a hard time with that. And I think there's a lot of effort and kind of responsibility put on different communication methods like the bulletin or the stage or whatever. But everyone kind of knows that relationships are what matter most, right?
Yep.
So for someone who doesn't get that opportunity, who's kind of stuck, down in the nursery or those different areas, and they don't get those opportunities, at the beginning or end of service, like some other more prominent or more upfront type of ministries, how do you recommend that they build those relationships and make the ask for volunteering? What does that look like?
Let me make sure I understand your question. Are you asking about the volunteer that's sitting in a room holding babies and they need to?
I'm asking about the ministry leader
Mm-hmm.
who doesn't get maybe the stage time or that same opportunity that other ministries do?
Thank
How
you.
do they go about recruiting people and,
Yeah.
making those connections?
Okay. I love that question because we were growing as a ministry. And in the beginning, there were like 30 volunteers that I looked at and said, we need to figure something out. And it grew to 200, 500, over 1,000. And through that process, I remember my executive director sat me down and he's like, so, Marianne, did you know you're the only one who doesn't ask for stage announcements? And of course, I was like, I didn't know I could ask for stage announcements because remember, y'all, I didn't grow up in church. And so I think the good news for that is we were growing and I never had any stage announcements. And so what I love about that reminder is that you start with what you have. You look around the room and you build from there. Like if you start with the 5 people you have, the 2 people you have, and you go, because that's what I did, is I would say, build into that relationship and say, how are you doing? I'm going to take 5 minutes before the doors open and the kids come running in here. And I really just want a really quick, how are you doing? And there are a lot of different strategies. You can use a number strategy. We used to do that. But then at the end of the day, before they leave, you may not do the poll's closed. Is that a poll I'm supposed to look at?
No, you're
No.
fine.
Okay, I'm sorry.
You're fine.
Distracted. Sorry, everybody. But I would look at the folks that you have and say, look, we can't do a full-blown debrief, but before you leave today, how did it go? Scale of 1 to 5. What's one thing I could do to have made this better, right? I would start with what you have because that's all I did. And when people really feel known and seen and that they matter, they tell other people. They're like, you know what? I really feel like I was burning out and now I have permission to leave. This is awesome. And the doors will open for the right people to come in. And that's not fluff. That's not me copying out. That is a real thing. And I don't have any other way to explain it to you how we grew from 30 volunteers to close to 1,000 volunteers just in this one little ministry. But it was purely starting with the relationships we currently had.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One other thing that you talked about today was making sure that your volunteers are in the right place to begin with, and knowing them well enough to know whether they have the right skills and all of that. So if someone is not in the right position, or when they are, maybe that early example of someone who thinks they know everything and kind of keeps it to themselves. How do you go about, strategically, I guess, how do you go about asking them to essentially get out of the way? What does that look like?
Yeah. It's a good old conversation that nobody wants to have, Brian. We would have volunteers that looked miserable. And I had leaders, and this is why you build the relationships, because if you build the relationships, that's the currency to have the hard conversation, right? So now, hopefully, you've had a relationship. You know that the person, it's not a fluke. They're not like there's something else going on. Then you just have to sit down. And we always would start with the question of, first of all, how are you doing? And they go, oh, I'm great. And it's like, tell me, how do you like serving in this ministry? Do you love it? Is it okay? Is it getting boring? Like, I just love your feedback. And if you really approach it with, I really want to listen. I mean, I would show up with a piece of paper, blank, and a pen, and I'd say, I'm going to take notes because I really want to remember what you have to say. People will tell you. And I would have people say, well, this one couple, they looked miserable. I mean, miserable. And so the leader asked them, they said, do you like serving or not? And they go, oh, we love it. And then she had to say, I love that you love it. It doesn't look like you love it. like, let us tell us what's going on. And they were like, what? No, we love it. And something changed. On the other hand, I've had conversations with leaders and they were like, yeah, I just don't know what else to do. I was like, well, let's brainstorm. Because I want what's best for you. Maybe it's a season where you need to take some rest. Maybe. But at the end of the day, it's just really being brave enough to have that conversation. If we really care for people, that's what we should be doing, is having the conversation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Another question that we got from Jean, it says, when you have a lot of volunteer needs, how do you choose which area to focus on first? So what gets your priority? She goes on and says that worship roles seem to get most attention, as that's often the most critical need or the most upfront need. So if you can't fill that need, then what do you do?
You
So I
can't.
think that's kind of two-part, right? How do you choose what area to focus on? And then if you can't find that, that primary need or that first need, then how do you go about moving around that, I guess?
Well, I don't, first of all, never do that in a vacuum. So think about in those different needs areas, even one person from each of those. Again, I am all about conversations, and this is about best practices of what I had to do, particularly since I didn't understand church that well in the beginning. So I really leaned on, what do you guys think? What's hard? What's easy? Why are we doing that? Should we stop doing it? Should we do something different? Like, it was all those things. And so if you're having to prioritize, and I want to make sure I understand the question correctly, is that if Jean is overseeing worship and maybe guest services and maybe children, and which one, get someone out of children, get someone out of production, get someone in worship, and say, look, there are needs everywhere. Also, that's always under the umbrella of what is the mission and strategy of your organization, your church, because everything you do has to align and point to that. So if it's we're about families, it's like, okay, well, we got to have worship and we're about families. That has got to be the priority right now. So I'm going to look at my week and carve out some time, 30 minutes, an hour, and just focus on that. If I have to go to a bookstore or the library so I can just get my head around it and invite some people in. But look at what your strategy and the mission of your organization is. See what areas, because I will say a lot of churches want to do everything. And some of it is just too much. And you do have to kind of prioritize that and put it on a list. So I actually did this. I put a list of things that I was being asked to do. And all of them were good things, all of them. And I went to my boss and I said, I love all these things you want me to do. I want to do them well. However, it's humanly impossible to do. And here's why. And I assigned time and values to each of them. I said, so nothing's going to get done well. Help me prioritize. And when I did that, they were like, oh, okay, Marion, I really want you to focus on these three. Oh, okay. And I'm not neglecting when I get the bandwidth for that and we grow, I will definitely keep that in the loop. So I don't know if that helps or not, but.
Yeah, I think that's good. Another question, kind of switching gears a little bit. Somebody asked, a lot of churches have some sort of safe church policy. So trying to protect, children, trying to protect leaders, all of that. And so often a part of that is background checks, of course, but also some sort of training or some sort of other, safety and security type of learning and education. So the question was that, or statement, I guess, is that this can become more of a barrier for new volunteers. So how do you go about that, or how do you incorporate that well, I guess?
Yep. I think that reminds me of one church website. I was looking to see how do they get volunteers. And before they even tell you what's available, you have to fill out a background check form. I think that's the extreme version. Like immediately I'm going, I don't know if I need that if I'm in the parking lot. I don't know. And so every church has to decide where those are, but I would encourage to move that down. So definitely non-negotiables were children, youth, leadership, because leaders have access to a lot of different areas and people and conversations, and there's propriety information and confidentiality issues you need to consider. But or if it handles money, so we had a coffee shop, so we had to just do a basic background check with that. And it's also, that comes in after you've already said, hey, come here and see what we have to offer. So I agree that could be a barrier, but I think it's how you present it and when you present it. Then people can make a decision. They could say, wow, if you need it for that, I'm going to opt to serve somewhere else. If you need it everywhere, then that's their decision. And if that's how your church or organization wants to run it, there's not a lot you can do about that.
Yeah, that's good. Going back to something that you said, I think in the last question, talking about time priorities, where you spend your focus and that kind of thing. Another question that came in from Carlos says that they have or want to have a volunteer team that spans a lot of different generations. So that means that you have different ways to communicate best and build relationships with different generations and different styles. So within one ministry, how can you prioritize that time and make sure that you're communicating and connecting well with your volunteers who have many different priorities based on age or other demographics too?
Right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's we need to build relationships. That's through communication, and we're all limited with time and scope of the number of people. And for me, you just kind of think about the disciples. There were 12. So when our ministry started growing and I was getting around 200 volunteers, it was Mary Ann and 200 volunteers. That was wrong on so many levels, but we were growing so quickly. So it was kind of like it just was happening. But I got pink eye and I got shingles at the same time. There's a whole story with that. But that really taught me what I was doing, as Jethro told Moses, was not good. And the people were not doing good. People were starting to complain and people were like, it was not good, a lot of discourse. So I had to start building a team of leaders and letting go so that leaders would have a smaller scope of people that they would pour into. Because Mary Ann was not going to have meaningful relationships with 200 people. It just wasn't possible. So to make sure that those relationships, and you have a lot to deal with, you just have to let go and let the right leaders and say, here's this group of people you can steward and care for and connect with. It doesn't have to be me. I mean, I want it to be me, if I'm honest. Like, I love doing that. But then my role changed where I was only pouring into the few leaders. And then that grew where I had leaders over them and I would just pour into them. And if I did my job well, made sure that they were encouraged and loved and trained and all the things that we were making sure we were on mission, then they would go and do the same thing with their leaders. And if our leaders were really in that same vein, they would then pour into their volunteers. And that's why we were able to replicate and duplicate as we grew in a healthy way. Does that answer the question?
I think so. To go along with that, I think this kind of speaks into what you were just talking about too. So to talk through another question, how best can a volunteer lead from below? So as you're creating those volunteer teams and leaders, how can they, when they're not in charge and when they're not in real leadership, how can they lead from below?
So if I'm talking to a volunteer and they're sitting there going, okay, I want some things changed. How do I tell the people upstairs, even though I don't have a leadership role? Is that your question?
I think so.
Okay. If it's not, we'll continue on something else. I love learning how people lead up well and how I respond when people are leading up. And it really comes from creating the culture. Like, y'all have got to create the culture where people have freedom to have a voice. You just have to do that. And then I would tell the volunteer, of course, if they have a complaint, they need to come with a solution, right? And it's always not necessarily what they say, but how they say it. So if someone would come to me and go, hey, Mary Ann, I mean, this happened. Let me just tell you, this happened all the time. I had a rule where we had Saturday night services and I wanted our ushers needed to be in the auditorium when we opened the doors. But we were there for such a long period of time, we fed our volunteers dinner. And so the idea was like, hey, half the ushers will go to dinner during first service, and half the ushers will go to service during the second dinner during the second service, right? We split them up because we didn't need everyone once the service started in the auditorium. Does that make sense? So that was the rule, because some teams would try to get dinner between services and they'd be late. The doors wouldn't open. We'd have no ushers in the second service. So I said, we're not going to do that anymore. Well, one day, the volunteers, some of the ushers walked up to me and they said, so, Marianne, we have a request. I was like, okay. They said, we know you have your rule. I'm like, yeah. And we know you want us in there. I'm like, yeah. They said, but we're family. See, we created that real connection. We have to eat dinner together. And I'm just listening. They said, so we have a proposition. They said, we would like to be able to eat dinner between the services so we can all eat together. Will you let us do that if we commit that we will be in the auditorium 5 minutes before the doors open? We make that commitment to you. And of course, I'm going to say, go for it. Make it happen. So they were so excited and happy. Well, my leaders that led that team that day heard about that. And these are leaders that are in the kitchen and in the coffee shop, not usher leaders. They're like, you know what? We're going to help them, Marianne. We're going to get their order of what they want for dinner, because it was like cafeteria. We're going to have a piece of paper. We're going to get their order, and we're going to set a table. We're going to reserve it. We're going to have their names. We're going to have their tea poured. So when they come out, all they have to do is sit down and eat. We're going to save them time from going through the line. So that's like the most awesome story of volunteers leading up.
And really giving them the opportunity to speak into that. But like you were saying earlier, that's all a result of relationship too. And during your presentation, you were also talking about how churches and ministries need to live into their language a little bit. So talking about family, talking about kind of that culture. Mm-hmm. Are there practical ways or tips that you could give some people who are kind of thinking through, how do I show more appreciation? How do I build those relationships? What are some ways that leaders can do that?
Yeah. I think the voice thing is the number one thing. I've had several churches that they only did one thing, and that was start the debrief. Set it up during the day and say, this is our church. This is your church. How would you want someone to feel if you had someone that you thought would never grace the doors of our church and they walked in 5 minutes before the end of the service, like they came that late, but if they walked in, you would fall on your face. How would you want them to be treated? This is how we're going to roll today. And then we're going to talk about it at the end. And that little debrief appreciation, I have all the stories. So let me tell you another quick one. So we had a group of volunteers, very small team. It's like maybe 5. And they were like our guides. They guide people around the church. And it was one particular Saturday night. Things happened. I became their leader. I haven't done that in years. I had no clue. Things had changed, but I'm like, okay, you guys lead me today. So we got through the day and I knew we needed to debrief. Well, they'd never heard such a thing, even though we were supposed to all be doing it. So I said, hey guys, stick around. We're going to have like not even 5 minutes. And they're looking at me, rolling their eyeballs. And I'm like, no, really, I promise, 5 minutes. Well, it was like herding cats, because 2 would be standing with me and the other 3 were off talking to a friend. And I'd go get those 3, and then those 2 would be going off. It was crazy. Finally, 5 of us. All I did was stand there in front of them and say, I could not have done this today without you. Thank you for help carrying me and carrying the mission of this church forward. I'm just so grateful. And I just want to pray for you before we leave. And I gave them like a 30-second prayer and thanked them. Well, the guys on the team, they just looked and went, group hug. And I was like, oh, and then they looked at me and go, why? We should do this all the time. And I went, you're supposed to be doing this all the time. And that was so simple, right? That didn't cost any money. It wasn't long, but there's something about looking someone in the eye and letting them know, I appreciate you. I would also, fun thing is do something outside of church. Like I sent a newsletter out recently. If you want to get on I send them out maybe once a month. You don't get inundated. But I said, here's some fun ideas because volunteers need to see you or their leaders outside of serving. It's like seeing your teachers at Target when you only see them in the classroom. It's different. So I said, have someone pick a fast food place. Everyone show up there after Sunday. And everyone, it's cheap. It's easy, right? They could be, why don't you go get whatever your area is famous for, donuts, French fries, and have everyone go get one from a different restaurant and have a taste test, like in a park, anywhere, and just have some fun together. I think that's a huge relationship builder, is really laughing and having fun together.
Food always helps too. Hey, so we're closing in on an hour and I want to respect people's time. So before we get to the last question, and we didn't quite get to all of them, so I'll ask one more question. But before we do that, how do people get in touch with you? How do they get on your email list? How do they, if they want to know more or talk with you more, how do they do that?
Well, you just can put my name, Marianne Sibley. It's right there.com. You'll get to my website and you can there'll be tabs there. You can email me, connect with me there, and I'll take it from there.
Awesome. And we'll make sure to include your link when we send this out too. But so the last question is for new ministry. So wanting to start a ministry from scratch. So, how do you, I guess the question is, how do you spark interest? How do you get that going from the ground up? How is that? Because obviously that looks different than, sustaining new or existing ministry. So how do you start from scratch?
I would say two things. Dream. Like, you just got to dream again. I don't think we do enough of that. I think we get starting a new ministry, we're thinking logistics, right? We're like, okay, we got to have 5 people here and we got to do it. And I would just encourage you, just take some time, be quiet, get a blank and just dream. Like, what could this look like? What could this look like? Would be huge. And then I would say, put yourselves in the shoes of someone who knows nothing about your ministry. And if they were walking into your space, what do they see? What do they hear? What do they smell? Who do they see? Like, we have to remember who we're serving and why we exist as a ministry, and remember what that looks like from that end. That should be helpful.
Awesome. I think so. Thank you again so much, Marianne, for joining us today. I really appreciated it. I learned a lot. So I hope everyone watching did as well. And thank you guys. Thank you all for joining us for the webinar today. We did record it, so we will send that out if you hopped in late or want to share it with others too. So I hope that you found today educating and equipping and encouraging too. So if you need anything from me, from Church Juice, or from Marianne, you can reach out to us and we'll be glad to answer any other questions that you have. Other than that, have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.